War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. It is 1805 and Russia is at a war with Napoleon Bonaparte's France. Tolstoy introduced many of the characters at a soiree held by Anna Pavlovna Skeher, a St. Petersburg socialite. This party marks 20 years old Pierre Bezukhov's first entrance into society because he has studied abroad since he was a child and was born an illegitimate son. Although he is smart, he fails to impress the party guest because he is so absent-minded and awkward. Prince Vasily Korygin tries to broker a marriage between his son Anatoly and a Princess Maria Bokovsky. Prince Andrei announced that he is joining the army as a high-ranking adjutant and leaving behind his pregnant wife. The Rostov family holds a banquet. Everyone is impressed by a young Natasha Rostov's beautiful and grace. 18 years old Nikolai decides to join the Horassars in a fit of patriotism. Natasha is in love with Boris Brobetskoy, and Nikolai is in love with his impoverished cousin Sonia. But couples promise to marry each other when the men get back from the war. Over the next few weeks, Pierre has a great time carousing in St. Petersburg with the Corinthian sons, among the other people. This ends with his father dies of a stroke because he is illegitimate. Pierre must struggle with Vasily's Korygin over who will inherit his father's estate. Pierre eventually wins out and becomes one of the richest men in Russia. Princess Brubetskaya managed to ingratiate herself with both Pierre and the Corinthians. Meanwhile, Prince Andrei prepares to go to the war to the chagrins and his father, wife, and sister. The next part of the volume takes place to the battlefield in Austria. Tolstoy introduced Dalokov, a sadistic friend of Anatoly Korygin. Prince Andrei and Kutuzov must deal with their capricious allies, the Austrians, in addition to fighting the French. Nikolai Rostov bonds with a new friend, Captain Denisov. When a soldier steals from Denisov, Nikolai is terrified after fighting in his fight battle, and both Nikolai and Andrei realize that the war is not what they had hoped it would be. Pierre marries Helen Korygin under pressure from Petersburg society. Anatoly Korygin's visit Bald Hills to propose to Princess Maria, but this falls through after he has a short-lived liaisons with Emil Brunei. Andrei's wife, Liz, has a son, Nikolaska, also Nikolai after his grandfather, and dies in childbirth. Nikolai sees the Caesars and becomes obsessed with him and the fatherland he represents in the epic battle of Austerlitz, and Andres is wounded and taken a French hospital, Nikolai develops a state for he resumes and Andres becoming completely disillusioned with the war. Nikolai brings Captain Denisov home when they are unalive, and Denisov falls in love with Natasha. She rejects his marriage proposal. There is a rumor that Helen Bizokov has had an affair with Delokov. So Pierre challenged Delokov to a duel. Pierre wants Delokov but can't bring himself to kill the injured man. This caused a violent fight between Pierre and his wife, and they end up separating. Nikolai's gambles with Delokov and loses much of his family's fortune. Pierre joins the Freemasons. Prince Andrei dedicates himself to spending time with his son while farming on his family rural estate. Pierre ostentatiously tries to improve the lives of his peasants, but fails because he doesn't have the business sense to make real change. It is now 1807, and Russia calls a truce with France. Helen Bezokov has a pair with Boris Brobetskoy, who has rapidly elevated himself in society through networking and hard work. Nikolai Rostov and Boris are both present when Tsar Alexander meets with Napoleon to sign the peace treaty. Prince Andrei visits Count Rostov and begins to fall in love with Natasha. Shortly after this, he is hired as a commissioner for the government effort at internal reform. He eventually becomes disillusioned with his job when he realizes the reform's efforts are insufficient and insincere. Pierre takes his wives back and is surprised to find that Helen has become a very successful socialite. Natasha and Boris no longer want to marry each other. Vera Rostov marries a lieutenant at a grand New Year's Eve ball. Natasha meets Prince Andrei and stuns him with her youth and good look. Andrei proposed to Natasha despite his father's wishes. Because Natasha is so young, the families agree to a one-year engagement during which Natasha will be free to break things off if she wishes. It is now 1810. Nikolai, Natasha, and Pyotr Rostov go hunting on their country estate and admire the lifestyle of their uncle, who lives in the countryside. Despite some doubt, Nikolai Rostov decides he still wants to marry Sonia and reiterates his promise to her. Pierre Bizokov suffers a spiritual crisis because the Masons leave him feeling unfulfilled. The elder, Prince Nikolai Bolkolsky, becomes senile and gets into the habits of verbally abusing his daughter Maria, who tries her best to care of him. Boris Brobetskoy courts both Maria and her best friend Julie Karagin. He marries Julie despite his better judgment. Natasha makes a bad first impression with her future in-laws. Prince Nikolai and Princess Maria. She falls in love with Anatoly Korogin and breaks off her engagement to Prince Andrei just as she is about eloped with Anatoly, a family friend. Maria Dmitrievna Arkharimovna stopped her. Anatoly runs away rather than facing Natasha's family. Natasha tries to poison herself, but recovers. Pierre falls in love with Natasha, but becomes a reliable platonic friend instead of taking advantage of her vulnerability. He sees the Great Comet of 1811. Russia and France go to war again. Prince Andrei is deeply hurt by Natasha's betrayal and refuses to take her back. The Tsar offers him a high-ranking military job, but Andrei rejects it so he can lead an army regiment. Nikolai participates in a battle, is horrified when he nearly kills a French dragon. Natasha's experience with Anatoly sobers her, and she becomes solemn and pious, although his change is short-lived. Pierre continues to love her from afar. Pyotr Rostov tries to see Tsar Alexander when the latter comes to the Moscow. He is nearly crushed by the crowd. He is a sort determined to join the army that his family allows him to enlist. Pierre alienates society with his liberal, pacifist opinion. General Kutuzov becomes a commander-in-chief of the military. When the French approach, the Bolkowski evacuate Bald Hills, with the exceptions of Andrei, who is with the army. When they get to their country state, the elder Prince Nikolai dies of a stroke and the mujiks, Russian peasants, revolt and imprison Princess Maria. Nikolai Rostov happens to the passing with his company, and he rescues her. They begin to fall in love, although Nikolai feels conflicted because he is already promised to marry Sonia. In one of the novel's most famous scenes, Pierre tries to participate in the Battle of Borodino but ends up walking aimlessly around the battlefield. Prince Andrei is gravely wounded in this battle. As the French advance on Moscow, most of the city population evacuates. Meanwhile, Helene Bezukov contemplates leaving Pierre for another man, although she doesn't know which suitor to marry. While evacuating Moscow, the Rostov lose many of their possessions when they agree to use their carts to transport wounded officers instead of their own belongings. Prince Andrei is among the wounded officers. Pierre is inspired by the common soldiers he sees at Borodino that he disguised himself as a peasant and sneaked into Moscow, hoping to murder Napoleon. Instead, he becomes a good Samaritan and helps a number of people, including a French captain, a woman being insulted, and a little girl lost in a burning house, and the French misunderstand what he's doing and arrest him. The French captured Moscow. Helene Bezukov dies of illness. Nikolai Rostov meets Princess Maria again in the province and begins to negotiate a marriage with her, despite his promise to Sonia. Meanwhile, Countess Rostov persuades Sonia to free Nikolai from his promise, since she doesn't want her son to marry a woman with no dowry. The French imprison Pierre and force him to watch an execution. He meets a simple religious peasant named Platon Karatev, who inspire him to live simply and value faith in God above all else. Natasha realizes that the wounded Prince Andrei is with her family and nurses him tenderly. Princess Maria also hears about his and rush to see her injured brother, and Andrei dies shortly after she arrives. And the Battle of Tarutino, and tired of the war, turns again to France, and they began to retreat. The French leave Moscow, taking their 30,000 prisoners of war, including Pierre, with them. After the French surrender, Russian partisans continued to attack the retreating troops. Denisov leads one of these groups, which also includes Dolokhov and approach Rostov. Denisov companies rise the French camps and frees Pierre and their other prisoners of war. However, Ports is shot in the head of his eyes during the actions. In the wake of Andres and Parts' death, Natasha becomes close friends with the Princess Maria. Pierre finally learns about his wife's death and that of his friend Prince Andrei. He becomes gravely ill but recovers. Between his illness and his long imprisonment, he becomes a changed man, altruistic and level-headed, and spiritually content. He visits Princess Maria and to the Rostov to give them his condolence. He realizes he's still in love with Natasha. He promised to Natasha and they marry. They have a wonderful relationship, and Natasha matures into the humble and dedicated mother. Nikolai Rostov marries Princess Maria, and Sonia lives with them as a kind of a servant. Nikolai and Maria have a turbulent relationship. So, in this story, Leo Tolstoy includes the novel with a epilogue in which he meditates about the relationship between individuals and history. Thank you for listening.